successes of Garda in relation to the other feuds, and we've all these young people now getting involved, but there's nobody in charge, so to speak, and they're fighting over turf now.
One person described it as disorganised crime because you have these young criminals who have access to weapons and aren't afraid to use them.
We've just got chaos out there now.
It's about mistrust, suspicion, disloyalty, big money, power, and that's what happens.
Total lack of respect for the law. They're basically putting two fingers up at them.
They're scared. Who does that? They're not human beings to do that.
After the deadly attack at the Regency Hotel in 2016 and the vicious feud that followed, claiming 18 lives, Garda, at first slow to respond, have brought the country's largest criminal organisation to its knees. With many members of the Kinahan cartel now jailed or living in exile, a power vacuum has been created in Ireland's Gangland. And with a lucrative drug market there for the taking, a new breed of ruthless and volatile criminal has stepped into the breach.
There's multiple different feuds going on all across the country. Within our capital, there's almost half a dozen different feuds. Most of these are in West Dublin, the Blanchardstown and Finglas area, but also in the Coolock area. We've the Drogheda feud in County Louth that's gathered a lot of publicity, and there's also been major feuds in Longford and in Sligo on the West Coast as well.
Well, every week we hear about shots being fired at homes in Ballymun, in Finglas and in Blanchardstown. But if we, look at each different area where we do have serious feuds, if we look at Blanchardstown, for example, like the Garda have recovered submachine guns, they've recovered handguns, they've arrested people for possession of firearms with intent to endanger life. We have seen shots being fired outside schools, and we have seen guns being recovered on grass areas where kids have picked them up.
The only word really could use to describe it would be chaotic. A lot has happened over the last few years. A lot of people have been taken out of the arena, and that has resulted in a lot of new, young gangs coming up.
There's a power vacuum there at the moment, which has been created by, I suppose, the successes of Garda in relation to the other feuds. So the people that would have had the power domain for so long are now gone, and their influence has waned. We've all these young people now getting involved, and there's still drugs coming into the country, still lots of money to be made, and they're stepping into the frame. But there's nobody in charge, so to speak, and they're fighting over turf now.
One person described it as disorganised crime because you have these young criminals who have access to weapons and aren't afraid to use them, so the danger is innocent people could be caught up in this.
In 2016, after the Regency Hotel attack, there was really one massive gang, which were the Kinahan cartel, that operation that were headquartered in Spain but based here in Ireland as well. And when that happened, there was a clear divide within that grouping. There was the Hutch side and there was the Kinahan side. And all the other gangs who were working away in the background really took one side or the other. It was just that clear at the time, the divide. But as time has gone on and the Garda operations have dismantled really that Kinahan organisation, in Ireland certainly, the other gangs are no longer aligned as strictly to anybody. So they've all sort of started fighting with one another now, and there's just no clear lines anymore. It's a very chaotic situation.
There's no doubt that these murders show, I suppose, how fragmented and complicated the gangland situation is at the moment. Loyalties, they mean very little.
The truth of it is that the only loyalties these guys have are to money, and that's the cause of absolutely everything, all the divides.
All gangland feuding, the root cause of it is money. Their biggest earner is drugs.
And that market is estimated to be worth about 100 million. It's a crass figure, but it's in and around that. And that's what these gangs are fighting for. They're fighting for that kind of money.
Early in 2019, a young drug dealer was killed in Swords, County Dublin. It was the first in an escalating cycle of gang violence, where each murder or attempted murder would be more brazen than the last.
Zach Parker was the first gangland murder of this year. He was killed in mid-January after he left a gym in Swords. He was a 23-year-old convicted drug dealer who wasn't heavily on the radar of the Gardaí or in fact the media, but Zach Parker would be considered part of a new breed of very young, flashy kind of drug dealers, and there was a number of theories as to why Zach Parker was shot dead, but the most common case was it was in relation to a massive drugs debt that he owed, that he was either unable or unwilling to pay back.
When you look at someone like Zach Parker, who wasn't a major Gangland player, but was still someone who was connected to Mr Flashy's gang in Finglas and in North Dublin, he's someone who had connections across the city to various drugs gangs, but he was someone who, like many of his contemporaries, lived the high life.
He was in his very early 20s. He had come up with that Gucci gang, as they call them, and he was just a young, flash, high-spending guy who was relying on the Kinahan name to throw his weight around. He would have been dealing in cocaine largely, travelling the world, living out his life on Instagram, pictures of his new shoes, his this, that and the other, all the spend, all out on Instagram. That is a new generation thing. That's what this new generation are doing. They're quite sort of like Instagram gangsters, really.
He's an example of a young man who get involved in organised crime, and ultimately the end goal is either prison or losing your life, and that's what's happened to him.
Zach Parker was one of the first associates of the Finglas-based Gucci gang to meet his end in 2019, but the gang would make headlines again later in the year.
Sean Little and Zach Parker were very good pals. Sean Little was a year younger than Zach, but they were very close. They were part of a new generation of younger criminals involved in drugs trafficking, particularly in North Dublin. These individuals would have traded off links to the Kinahan cartel.
Sean Little was lured to his death by somebody he trusted, and again the theories around his murder, there's quite a few, but they all lead back to the fact that he had stepped on a number of toes. He had used that Kinahan name to try and put himself at the top of the gang ladder in his own area, and it didn't work. He was then seen as fair game himself.
He was the victim of a double cross, where it's suspected at least 2 of his pals were involved in this murder. One of them was an Iranian asylum seeker called Hamid Sanambar, and the other was an older associate of his from the Coolock area. Both men were prominent mourners in the days after the shooting.
17 hours later, Jordan Davis was shot dead in Darndale. Somebody is before the courts in connection with that murder.
Jordan Davis was a low-level drug dealer operating in the Darndale area of the city. He wasn't considered a major criminal. He had some very minor drugs possession charges. Less than an hour before Jordan Davis was murdered, he posted an online tribute to Sean Little, but he was walking with his 4-month-old baby in a buggy when he was targeted in a laneway in Darndale by an unmasked gunman who shot him a number of times in the head.
What we're saying to the public and to parents and to young men and women is please, please, please do not get involved at any level.
Assistant Commissioner Pat Leahy has seen the drug trade take many lives in a pattern of violence he's all too familiar with.
There's a trend in this, like, if people wanted to go back and look at all the coverage, within the press, open source information, and look at the ages of all the people that have died associated with this. There's a certain trend there, There is no lifespan, long lifespan in the drugs industry, for sure. And if you're going to get into that, you need to know that at the end of the day, this is going to come to a bad end.
The situation with Hamid Sanambar, when you're looking at Gangland, I suppose there are some things that happen that you just go, you couldn't write it. And that was one of those things for me. I had actually heard of this Iranian. For up to, say, maybe 6 months, I had heard of his presence. I had heard a number of stories about him. I had been told at one stage that he was Daniel Kinahan's personal hitman, that he'd been sent to Ireland to finish off the Hutch gang. I'd heard that he had fought in Syria with IS, that he was an expert beheader. He was there up at the scene after Sean Little was shot, and as the family of Sean Little were awaiting the release of his body and there was a gathering at the house, he appears to have gone up to pay his respects, and he was shot dead in the front garden.
It was a hugely planned murder. There was 3 gunmen. 2 guns were recovered by Gardaí. The Iranian national was shot multiple times in the head.
It's extraordinary where you have someone who was shot outside a wake, someone who was involved in organised crime. He did have connections to the Kinahan gang in the past. He had previous meetings with Daniel Kinahan in Spain. He's been linked to numerous murders himself, but he was someone who was involved with these younger gangs in the North Dublin area, someone who was muscled, someone who was seen as willing to use a gun and had been linked to other shootings in the past, but because of his alleged involvement in the Little murder, which was never proven, that was enough to seal his fate.
You're talking about criminals, you're talking about drugs. A lot of them are taking their own product, you know, so in terms of suspicion and paranoia, this is part and parcel of this particular line of business. It's a very insidious type of business, so when things go wrong and suspicion rises, you know, people become fearful for their own safety, and one of the ways that they deal with that is they end up killing the person that they think, you know, is out to get them.
When they start going to war, these mobs start becoming really paranoid, and all of a sudden they think they have somebody within their ranks who's working with the opposition, and it's a situation that can implode as much as it can explode.
While young, ruthless criminals fight for a piece of Ireland's lucrative drug trade, observers are left asking, why is this happening? The answer can be found in a now infamous North Dublin hotel. A new generation of gangsters are battling for a slice of Ireland's lucrative drug trade in a market previously dominated by the Kinahan cartel. For years, the cartel held Ireland's drug trade in an iron grip. No other gang moved without Kinahan's say-so. But in 2016, that grip began to weaken. Pressure from Gardaí and international law enforcement was taking its toll. But it was internal strife that would deal the biggest blow. And that began with a Tiger kidnapping in 2009.
10 years ago, the Hutch gang and the Kinahan gang, they were all the same criminal organisation. The Hutch organisation were specialists in armed robberies and Tiger kidnappings. And one of the most lucrative of these Tiger kidnappings that ever happened at the College Green, Bank of Ireland, around 10 years ago.
The biggest bank robbery in the state's history went into motion last Thursday evening. A gang of 6 men entered this house in Kilteal in County Kildare. Bank official Shane Travers was there with his girlfriend Stephanie Smith, Stephanie's mother Joan Smith and Joan's 5-year-old grandson. The gang struck Joan in the face with the butt of a gun and smashed a vase over Stephanie's head. They, along with the 5-year-old, were bound together with gaffer tape, blindfolded and then driven in a van to this location in Ashbourne. On Friday morning, the gang forced Shane Travers to go into the Bank of Ireland on College Green in Dublin city centre to gather as much money as possible.
The gang got away with €7.6 million. It was the largest bank robbery in the history of the state.
Gary Hutch was one of the main organisers of this crime, and he was arrested but never charged in relation to it. The Hutch side of this gang found themselves with millions of euro at their disposal, and Gardaí have investigated whether a figure of €4 million was handed over by the Hutch side to the Kinahan side to essentially launder.
Gary Hutch provides the Kinahan cartel who have the contacts, who have the money laundering operations across Europe and indeed across the world to launder cash from Tiger kidnappings, from robberies and from drugs. So when Gary Hutch provides the Kinahan cartel with the cash to launder, he doesn't get any returns. He starts to panic, he starts to get angry, he takes it out on Daniel Kinahan.
There was a shooting at Daniel Kinahan's villa in Spain, and Jamie Moore, the boxing coach, was shot that time. He survived. That shooting was blamed on the Hutch faction.
The botched hit in Marbella that saw innocent victim Jamie Moore injured was the first crack in the Hutch-Kinahan alliance. Photojournalist Porrick O'Reilly has been working undercover for over 20 years, photographing some of Ireland's most dangerous criminals, and was well placed to watch the cartel implode.
Gary sent a hitman. The hitman shot the wrong guy during the night. This led to Daniel knowing then that it was Gary that had sent the hitman. So this created pandemonium within the Hutch family back in Dublin. So Gary was flown back to Dublin. And over the coming months, senior members of the Hutch gang met senior members of the cartel in a couple of locations around Ireland. And they had decided that there would have to be money paid over for compensation for the attempted murder of Daniel. There was a figure of 200,000 paid over. They wanted to know who the shooter was, so he was given up and he was punished in Drumcondra. He was shot in the leg. That was done. They shook hands. Everyone thought that everything was okay. Everything was smoothed over. Gary went back to Spain and worked with Daniel again as normal, but both of them would have felt that it wasn't normal.
Relationships between the two sides just began to get worse and worse throughout 2014 and 2015, and ultimately Gary Hutch was murdered in September 2015 on the orders of the Kinahan side of the faction.
I remember that day as if it was yesterday, and I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and I was in the newsroom working, and the calls came through that there was a major incident at the Regency Hotel. There was a lot of concern of what was happening, what was unfolding that day, and as the day progressed, we got to see and we got to understand the sheer horror of what unfolded. There was various video footage taken. You remember the young kid who was saying, "Daddy, Daddy, what's going on?" He was screaming, and then it was in the immediate aftermath you realise this is what's happened here in broad daylight. Criminals dressed as members of the ERU go into a busy hotel with families, with kids there at a boxing weigh-in, a very public event, and kill a well-known Kinahan associate. Now, without question, there was a lot of military-like planning went into that, but the ultimate aim of that enterprise was to murder Daniel Kinahan. So it was a failure. He managed to escape, and David Byrne, by the end of that day, lay dead. And it's without question one of the most infamous attacks in Irish gangland history. It made headlines around the world, and it did lead to a cycle of violence that we've never seen here before.
In my 30 years, I've never heard anything that I could compare to that. The Hutch gang entered the Regency Hotel, dressed as emergency response gardaí, equipped with AK-47s. One of the gang, male, dressed as a woman, with another man had been on a flat cap, entering through a different entrance, carrying handguns.
The man in drag and Kevin Flatcap Murray enter the hotel and begin searching for Daniel Kinahan. Shots are fired in the lobby and people began to flee the hotel. Senior Kinahan Lieutenant David Byrne is seen here running away from the lobby, but he turns back towards the main entrance. He is spotted by one of the men disguised as an ERU officer. Byrne is shot and wounded. As the other gunmen enter the lobby, Byrne is shot again. The gang continue to sweep the hotel in search of Daniel Kinahan. The man in drag is overheard saying, "I can't find him. I don't know where he is." The gang then make their escape. David Byrne is shot again as the gang exit the hotel. Byrne was shot up to 6 times in the head, face and stomach. Patrick Hutch was put on trial for the murder of David Byrne at the Regency Hotel, but the trial ultimately collapsed and the charges against Patrick Hutch were dropped. The murder of Gary Hutch and the reprisal at the Regency Hotel ultimately splintered the Hutch-Kinahan group. The two previously aligned factions went to war, sparking the deadliest gang feud in Ireland's history.
Well, it's personal. Let's not forget that. You know, it is personal what has happened since the Regency, where you have David Byrne murdered, a senior Kinahan cartel lieutenant. He is murdered in broad daylight, and without question, like we all knew there was going to be a form of revenge.
The cartel, they wanted killings. They were thirsty for killings after David had been killed. That's the way that one garda described it to me 2 years ago. They just want blood. They want bodies. That's what's being said at meetings. We want bodies.
And there were bodies. Just 3 days later, the Kinahans retaliated by gunning down Eddie Hutch Sr., the monk's brother. Many more Hutch family members would be killed, including the monk's nephews, Gareth Hutch and Derek Coakley Hutch. Close friends of the monk would also be targeted. Noel Duggan and Noel Kerwin were both victims of the feud, and disturbingly, 2 innocent men were killed in a case of mistaken identity. Martin O'Rourke was shot on Sheriff Street in the inner city, while Trevor O'Neill was shot in Majorca while on holiday with his family. With a rising body count, questions were asked about the Guards' readiness to tackle the murderous feud.
We have spoken on earlier occasions about our unrelenting approach to tackling organised crime, and particularly since the incident at the Regency Hotel, where obviously we were presented with a very serious scenario, and where it was suggested that the Garda Síochána may not have been prepared. Coming out of a recession, there probably was some truth in that.
When we end up going into an austerity situation where the units were reduced, people started migrating back onto what we would call the regular shift. Community policing took a pretty significant hit. So we were kind of withdrawing from communities to a large extent. So the information that really is the lifeblood of policing, was choked off. That really caused us significant damage. That's where our intelligence, that's where our information comes from, and we took a hit in relation to that, for sure.
If you recall, the first people who responded to that incident were members of the Garda who were unarmed. The Garda also had no intelligence in place that anything was going to take place that day, and indeed, since the Regency, they've really upped their game. A lot of resources have been pumped into the Garda. The state did respond to the Regency because of it was beamed around the world about what happened that day, and now we've seen resources being put in place, resources that weren't there in the recession in previous years, but now they have those in place that directly confront the people involved in that and the people involved in the feud which stemmed from the Regency.
While Gardaí may have been caught on the back foot, 3 years later their plan to dismantle the Kinahan organisation is bearing fruit.
On the Kinahan side, the investigation to try and dismantle that organisation was a 5 to 6 year plan, and they would be about halfway through that now. They've certainly dismantled it here in Ireland. There's up to 40 key members of the gang and others they've hired for murders, etc., in prison, either convicted on serious offences or facing charges for serious offences. They have caused huge ripples in Gangland by doing that, and they've left this vacuum because most of the feared and the big names from that organisation are either in jail or they've left the country. So that leaves opportunities.
And across the country, several gangs have rushed to exploit these opportunities with deadly intent. As the process of dismantling the Kinahan cartel is well underway in Ireland and abroad, a power vacuum is developing and a vicious new generation of criminals anxious to claim a piece of Kinahan turf are going to war. The attack on the Regency was the catalyst that led to the organisation being dismantled. The attack sparked a public outcry that spurred the government and the Garda Síochána into action. But this is not the first time that a shocking murder and the resulting public outcry have provoked the authorities to take extreme action, and as a result create a power vacuum in Ireland's gangland. In June 1996, a motorbike pulled up alongside Veronica Guerin's car as she was stopped in traffic. The pillion passenger opened fire. The journalist was shot 6 times. The murder led to a national outcry. The government responded with tough new gangland legislation, the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and the most extensive murder investigation in the state's history.
When you go back to John Gilligan, who had set up a very lucrative cannabis importation business, after the murder of Veronica Guerin in 1996 and the breakup of his gang, because it was a similar politically backed Garda offensive, the dissipation of his gang left a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by very young, very ambitious guys from the Crumlin Drimna area, who also then went to war in a very chaotic situation that lasted 10 years and cost 16 to 18 lives. Always, when a big player is removed, there is this vacuum, and you do see gang wars happening within that space of time.
This vacuum, ironically, was filled eventually by Christy Kinahan, who became far bigger and better at drugs trafficking than John Gilligan ever was, and became the most powerful crime leader in the country and one of the most powerful in Europe.
One reason the current fighting is so furious is the sheer scale of the vacuum the Kinahans have left behind and the cash value of the vacant drug empire.
At one point, there was a figure going around that the Kinahans controlled 90% of the drug market across Ireland.
At the height of their powers, the Kinahan cartel were Ireland's #1 crime organisation. They were one of the biggest in Europe and in fact the world. They were not just supplying gangs in Dublin, they were supplying gangs in Limerick and the West Coast, into Northern Ireland, the UK.
Well, the origins of the Kinahan gang is in Ireland, where you have Christy Kinahan and the organisation that he built up. We have his 2 sons in charge of that organisation as well. So they've been major players in the Irish gangland scene, but when they were in Ireland, they were also cultivating contacts in Belgium, in Holland and the UK. But then they leave Ireland to establish their base in Marbella, which is a hotbed of organised crime across Europe, and you have a lot of drugs coming into southern Spain. The Spanish realised they're dealing with, as they called them, the Irish Mafia. So the Garda and the Spanish authorities worked closely together. They launched Operation Shovel in 2010. The Kinahan leadership are arrested on drugs offences and money laundering. The investigation continues. They're subsequently released as that investigation remains open. They then move to Dubai after the Regency because of the heat that they brought on themselves. I mean, you now have the Garda working with the DEA and the FBI. Every police force, every police agency is aware of the threat posed by the Kinahan gang, and that's not good for business, and that's why they don't come back to Ireland, because their activities are still ongoing here. This is the origin where they come from, but because of the gangland legislation here, they're terrified of being arrested or shot.
Over the last 3 years, because of the success of this Garda plan, this long-term Garda plan, there's a realisation now that when it comes to Ireland, the Kinahans aren't in control, and people aren't scared of them anymore. You have that Finglas group known as the Flashy Mob, the Gucci Gang. They would be a classic example. They have been collecting money, terrorising people, claimed ownership of an entire area, all on the word of they were Kinahan connected, and nobody would touch them, nobody would go near them. And then all hell broke loose because it was decided that they weren't. There was no protection coming from the Kinahans. The Kinahans were gone. The Kinahans are in Dubai. They're a bit too far away to save anybody here now. The other gangs have been suppressed for a long time and have been living under the shadow of this great big boss, have now sort of gone, oh, hang on a second, I'm going to take a little pop here, and that's what happened, and you've just got chaos out there now.
That chaos has been felt across the country, but particularly in West Dublin, where a number of gangs have gone to war.
The Cardiff feud, I suppose, came to public attention for the first time earlier this year, when the 2 factions were literally having a running gun battle in the States, in the Cardiff area, in the middle of the day during a weekday, and ever since then it really has escalated.
You know, Cardiff has been festering there for almost a year, perhaps just over a year, but where you have 2 families there who are heavily involved in drug dealing. And again, like many other feuds, you have these guys previously working together. You know, things are going well, they're sharing their patch, they're selling different forms of drugs in their community. But when greed sets in, when paranoia sets in, when one gang accuses another gang of keeping cash for themselves, and the only way that they see to resolve their differences, it's not like a normal business, is to use violence and the threat of violence. And it has grown from, you know, intimidation online, people being beaten up on the street, the wives and their partners being attacked of different gang members, people who were once friends.
These gang leaders are only aged in their early 20s, and they're feuding with a faction that would have historic links to the notorious Westies gangs, who kind of terrorised that area in the 1990s. What it has led to is an extremely disturbing series of pipe bomb attacks, shootings, assaults, and the seizure of huge amounts of drugs and firearms by Gardaí. Apart from seeing the running shooting battle in the estates, saw a very disturbing incident a few weeks after that, where there was an attempted gun murder at a school. This led to the school being put into a state of shutdown. Kids were due to be leaving the school at the time the shooting happened, and they were forced to be locked into school for their own protection.
Again, they're very young, very fast living, and that situation is probably the most dangerous of all, because these are the guys who really do not think before they take out a gun.
30 minutes north of Dublin, another feud.
The Drogheda feud is probably the most high-profile feud that has happened outside of Dublin. Again, like virtually all these feuds, it involves criminals that were all part of the same crime organisation splitting apart and going their separate ways and having a major dispute that has escalated into extreme violence. In the Drogheda feud, on one side, you have criminal travellers as well as some dissident Republicans. Some of its most prominent members would be Owen Maguire, who was left paralysed after being shot in July of last year. His brother Brendan, who also was lucky to survive after being shot in February of this year in Drogheda. This gang are in a face-off against a gang of younger criminals who have strong links to North Dublin gangsters.
Without question, it is one to watch, and that's why the Garda have made it a huge priority in the County Louth area, where they are, they still have their patrols every day. They still monitoring those heavily involved. You also throw into the mix Cornelius Price, a very volatile and violent criminal who has now been released from prison. He has sided with the Maguire faction of this criminal feud, and there are concerns that his presence could lead to an escalation of violence.
It's a battle for territory, but ultimately drugs are the foundation for the whole problem, really, and it's that it seems to be a very lucrative business for those who are involved. I believe that members of both of the rival gangs at the moment, that they did work together in that whole drug trade beforehand, and then they decided to kind of split up the territory and go on their own, go independent of each other, and that's what's caused the feud.
While the Drogheda feud had seen brutal acts of violence committed by both factions, miraculously no one had lost their life. But that changed in late August when 29-year-old Keith Brannigan was targeted.
Good evening. Garda are investigating following a fatal shooting in County Louth today. A man in his 30s was shot dead at a caravan park in Clogherhead this afternoon.
Well, it certainly looks like the ongoing Drogheda feud has claimed its first murder victim. This man in his early 30s was working on some decking here behind me in this caravan site at a mobile home when a car pulled into the caravan site. A number of shots were fired, possibly from a semi-automatic. The man was struck and fatally wounded.
This was a particularly brutal murder, carried out in the middle of the day, carried out in a holiday park towards the last days of the summer holidays, when there was lots of families around, when there was lots of children in the locality. I think that showed us what they are capable of. The reckless nature of this, the total lack of respect for the law. They're basically putting two fingers up at them. The Garda have a big presence in Drogheda. They're doing the best that they can and doing an excellent job, but a lot of these people just have absolutely no regard for them and don't seem to care.
Back in the olden days, you would have been able to bring somebody forward to do a little bit of mediation, and sometimes even the gangs, it sounds like a lifetime ago, but they used to even listen to priests. Nowadays there's no talking, there's no mediation whatsoever. This will play itself out until one or other is killed.
I'm not sure that these people are terribly open to persuasion from the likes of me, but I'm really appealing to everybody involved just to stand back a little bit and to assess what they're doing. I see the futility of this. That it serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever.
When gang violence happens, it is sudden and brutal, but for those left behind, there is a lasting impact.
Who does that? They're not human beings to do that. Just discarded. It meant nothing to them.
While gangland violence has left many dead, it's often the innocent family of the victims who suffer the most. Anthony Keegan and Owen O'Connor were killed in 2014 in a brutal double murder in Cavan. 5 years later, Owen's family still have no closure.
He had 2 children, a bit reserved, yeah, but a very good son, very good to me. I just loved him so much, and he'd the same with me. He went off with his friend Anthony Keegan, and they went somewhere I wasn't aware of where they went. He borrowed my car. and off they went. I now know that they went to Cavan, and it was really the next day that we all became concerned for Owen, because it wasn't like him to go missing off the radar like that and not be in touch. Things didn't seem right, you know, and my other two sons was trying to protect me, not to let me know, but it didn't work out that way. They thought maybe he'd come back. That didn't happen. The police came, and yeah, they took us serious from word go, and they became concerned. I think the police knew, because a double cross was mentioned straight away, but that didn't mean anything to me.
3 days later, the car that Owen and Anthony were travelling in was found abandoned in Westmeath.
It didn't look good. Like, why was my car there? Who brought it there? Why?
And 5 weeks later, a gruesome discovery on a lake island in County Cavan.
Over the past number of weeks, extensive searches have been carried out in this area for them. Those searches appear to have come to a grim conclusion here yesterday afternoon. The two bodies discovered on that island were badly decomposed, and it's understood an effort had been made to conceal them.
So I died inside that day. Shocked. You couldn't explain it. But they had a good idea, it was them. They spoke to my sons. And it turned out it was them. Left. Discarded. Who does that? They're not human beings to do that. Just discarded. It meant nothing to them.
Gardaí believe Owen and Anthony were minor figures working as debt collectors for a major drug gang based in North Dublin. 5 years later, the investigation into the murders is ongoing. In late 2016, the Hutch-Kinahan feud is dominating the headlines, and days before Christmas, Jean O'Connor's life is again impacted by gang violence. When a friend of the monk, Noel Kerwin, is gunned down, an innocent victim targeted because he was pictured with the monk at Eddie Hutch's funeral.
Noel Kerwin was my brother-in-law, and was a great help to me when Owen went missing and was murdered. I relied on him. He was such a good friend to me, apart from being my brother-in-law. He wasn't involved in any criminal gang. Murdered because some people said he was to be murdered.
While Jean O'Connor's life has been turned upside down by gang violence, the Gardaí have not been idle. In late July, a significant day in court.
On the news at 5:30 this evening, a big Garda blow against the Kinahan crime cartel. 6 associates of the organised gangster group jailed, including a so-called hit-for-hire team.
Well, Assistant Commissioner John O'Driscoll has said that today was unprecedented in terms of the number of associates of the Kinahan gang that were dealt with before the Special Criminal Court. 6 in total today, 9 since the 15th of July.
From a policing point of view, the only really effective policing when it comes to organised crime is targeting individuals and gangs. And like a terrorist cell, the point is trying to remove individuals from them and jail them for a period of time. If you get a jail sentence of 10 years for a key player, you've got them off the street. So you're breaking up the cell, you're breaking up the gang.
Many observers would say that the Kinahan cartel are currently in a state of crisis. Gardaí have had great success against them in terms of seizing tens of millions euro worth of drugs, literally hundreds of firearms. Dozens of key players have been locked up.
And in the UK, another breakthrough as one of the most senior cartel figures goes before the courts. Thomas Bomber Kavanagh was jailed for 3 years for having an illegal 10,000-volt stun gun disguised as a torch among an arsenal of weaponry in his home in Birmingham. He remains at the centre of major investigations by Gardaí and the UK's National Crime Agency into the Kinahan cartel's drug smuggling network.
Thomas Bomber Kavanagh was described in court in their submissions to the High Court by the Criminal Assets Bureau as the second in command of the Kinahan cartel. He was just one step below Daniel Kinahan. This was said in court. He was even above Liam Byrne, who was one of Daniel Kinahan's best friends. So his arrest is significant, and he's the most senior member of the Kinahan gang to be brought before the courts.
In terms of them being dismantled, not quite yet. There's a lot of work to be done yet, and if we were to take our foot off the pedal at this stage, I think we might regret it.
Even as authorities inch closer to toppling the Kinahan organisation, the drug trade is now more lucrative than ever, and criminal gangs will continue to crop up to take advantage of the surging market. It's a market ultimately fuelled by drug users.
The gangs exist primarily to make money. That's their number one function, that's their number one aim. And how do they make money? That's by selling drugs. I think in terms of cocaine, you have to look at society in general, and you have to look at the current state of the economy at the moment. Things are going well again. We're now in a boom. You know, we did come through a recession, but we're now in a boom, and there are people out there who will use cocaine every weekend. There is a huge demand from it. But when these people using cocaine, they have to realise that where is it coming from? It can only come from one source, and that's organised crime.
You know, these are people that we meet and we sit beside at work every day across the country. There's the market for drugs. It's not the person that you can see ravaged on the street. You know, that's a very small part of the drugs market.
I think it's something that the whole of society has to reflect on a little bit. You know, there's a lot of, unfortunately, soft users of drugs, and they're not the people in the poorer estates or the places where we expect to find them. I mean, a lot of them are in the middle classes and things like that, are using drugs for a social occasion. But that is actually fueling the whole drugs trade and the violence that's occurring as a result of that. So I think people have to think about their habits in relation to drugs.
So anybody who's going out on a Friday or Saturday night taking cocaine, you know, they're part of the drugs trade. That's the reality of it. So they can't absolve themselves of a great responsibility around all of this, you know, and I hope they don't, you know, and I hope, look, at some stage they'll have some sleepless nights when they're thinking about how they're contributing to the misery, you know, that communities are enduring as a consequence of the collective actions of people that are sponsoring the drug trade.
And while wider social issues urgently need to be tackled, the Gardaí's focus is criminal activity, and as such they're singularly focused on bringing gang leadership before the courts, and one man in particular.
Daniel Kinahan is in Dubai, and he's trapped there now. Not a bad place to be trapped. He's living on the Palm in a very expensive villa, and he would have a number of his key lieutenants around him out there, up to 12. They're still operating the business. They have obviously moved to, some would say, billionaire status with this. You can't go any higher than that. And now Daniel Kinahan, who is out in Dubai, and I suppose who all these young guys dream of becoming, he is up there at the very, very top. But while he's in Dubai and it looks as if he's living a very charmed life, he has the forces of Europe after him.
I mean, obviously he's a target for the guards, no doubt about that. I mean, where they are in the pecking order at this point in time, look, it really wouldn't be useful to get into that. Are they still there? Yes. Are they still targets of Garda Síochána? Absolutely. And will they remain so? Absolutely.
On the ground here, the guards are being busied by the feuding gangs, fighting for a small slice of that pie. But internationally, their big prize is still Daniel Kinahan, and part of that policing plan that was developed in 2016 after the Regency Hotel is to ultimately dismantle the organisation and see him before the courts.
Once the guards and the state, you know, get you in their sights, you're pretty much in trouble, that's for sure. And that has played out. We've seen that time and time again.